More countries ban the Boeing 737 MAX from their skies after 2 fatal crashes in just 5 months. But the US and the plane maker say the jet is safe. So who's right? And how will the accident affect confidence in modern air travel? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Boeing calls the 737 the most popular jet aircraft of all time. The US playmaker hoped its new 737 MAX 8 would bring in a new era of passenger safety. But 2 crashes in 5 months are raising serious questions. Investigators are trying to work out what caused an Ethiopian Airlines 737 MAX to go down just after takeoff on Sunday, killing all 157 people on board. Some believe there are remarkable similarities to another crash that killed 189 people in Indonesia in October. More countries are grounding the planes and passengers are cancelling their trips. But Boeing and US aviation regulators say there's nothing to worry about. We'll bring in our panel of expert guests in a moment. But first, Rob Reynolds reports from Seattle, where the planes are assembled.
As investigators sifted through the wreckage outside Addis Ababa, more and more of Boeing's 737 MAX aircraft were being grounded in countries around the world, but not in the United States, where aviation officials insist the aircraft is safe. Many U.S. airline passengers, a flight attendants union, and aircraft experts are calling for it to be grounded, while in Washington, lawmakers planned hearings on aviation safety.
The 737 MAX 8 should be grounded immediately. There is no reason for American flyers to be less safe than China, Ethiopia, Argentina, Mexico, and now apparently the United Kingdom.
Well, I think out of an abundance of caution and, frankly, common sense, it makes sense to ground an aircraft that's been involved in 2 very tragic accidents in only 6 months.
Speculation into the cause of the 2 separate crashes has centered on flight control software. Several U.S.-based airline pilots reported potentially dangerous behavior of the 737 MAX's flight control system, which, they say, plunged the plane into a steep dive before the crews disconnected the computer system and flew the aircraft manually. But Boeing insists its best-selling aircraft remains safe. The U.S. Federal Aviation Agency, or FAA, requires the company to undertake a software enhancement that Boeing says will be deployed on the MAX fleet in the coming weeks. Boeing says the update to maneuvering, flight control, and pilot display software would make, quote, an already safe aircraft even safer. President Donald Trump spoke by phone with Boeing CEO Dennis Muilenburg, who has appeared with Trump several times at events in recent years. The call followed 2 Trump tweets complaining that airplanes had become too complicated. There is a precedent for a global ban. In 2013, U.S. officials ordered Boeing to take its massive new Dreamliner out of service to resolve a problem with battery fires. Grounding the entire worldwide fleet of all Boeing's 737 MAX aircraft would cost the company somewhere between $1 and $5 billion. That's according to Wall Street analysts. But that would be a cost that Boeing would be well able to absorb. The company just posted revenues of over $100 billion, and that includes profits of more than $10 billion. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Seattle.
So, watching Rob's report, should we be concerned about flying? The Netherlands-based aviation safety network says deaths from plane crashes have fallen steadily over the last 2 decades. In 2005, at least 1,000 people were killed on commercial flights worldwide. That figure went down to 0 in 2017. Last year, the number of deaths just exceeded 500. But aviation analysts say fatal crashes are still rare. The Dutch company 270 estimates there was 1 fatal accident for every 3 million flights making 2018 the third safest year on record. Let's discuss this more now with our panel of guests. And in New York, we have Kyle Bailey. He's a pilot and former FAA safety team representative. In Fredericksburg, Texas, via Skype, we have Todd Curtis. He's a former airline safety engineer at Boeing. And in Singapore, Matt Driscoll. He's the editor of Asian Aviation magazine. Welcome to all of you. If I could start in Singapore with you, Matt. The 737, many of our viewers will have flown on it. It first flew back in 1967. In fact, in April 67, a month before I was born. But this 737 MAX is new. Explain the differences for us.
Well, the MAX is, as you said, it's a new airplane. It's sort of the follow-on from the 737 new generation. It's got a longer fuselage. It's got more fuel-efficient engines. It's got a beefier undercarriage, the landing gear, and things like that. And it's really sort of the hopes and dreams of Boeing's future, because the 737's narrow bodies, which is a 737 and also the Airbus A320, those are really the workhorses of the aviation industry now. If you look at the numbers, more than 4 billion people flew last year, and a lot of those people flew on narrow-body aircraft. They're very good at point-to-point. The airlines pack them to the gills, and they really are the future of aviation, especially in Asia, because you've got very short hops from Vietnam to Malaysia or Singapore to the Philippines or something like that, and those planes are perfect for it.
We'll come to you, Todd, in a moment, because you used to work for Boeing, and this is such an important aircraft for Boeing. But Kyle, you used to work for the FAA and their safety team. Tell us what we know about these two crashes, and also where the similarities might be from what we know, not the speculation, but what we actually know.
Right now, the similarities are almost, for lack of a better term, perfect similarities. We're talking minutes after takeoff, same exact aircraft type, new aircraft. The airplanes were both in a climb profile. It's really just a perfect match when it comes to, the phase of flight that these aircraft were in.
Todd, what's your view on the two crashes happening less than 5 months after each other? How disturbing are these similarities to you when you look at it?
Well, on the first point, it's very unusual to have a very new model aircraft have two crashes in short succession. This was common in the early days of jet aviation, in the 60s and 70s when new models were introduced. But recently, that hasn't been the case. So this stands out on that note. On the other hand, the other similarities are quite striking. Similar age of the aircraft. In fact, the Ethiopian aircraft was delivered several weeks after the Lion Air crash in Indonesia. And also, even though there is a lot more information about the Lion Air crash currently, and presumably the pilots of the Ethiopian aircraft would have known about this crash and how to avoid it, still a very similar crash occurred.
And Matt, in terms of these two airlines, there have been some question marks about Lion Air, but as we've just heard, they were brand new planes, only recently delivered by Boeing. And Ethiopia Airlines, it's worth telling our viewers, is one of the key players in Pan-African aviation with a pretty good record, yes?
Well, from what I understand, yes. I mean, obviously we focus on Asia, and Lion Air actually did not have and does not have the best reputation in the world when it comes to aviation safety. Indonesia, as a rule, also doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to aviation safety. But from what I understand and from what I've read, Ethiopian Airlines was actually considered a very good airline. I think a lot of NGOs and a lot of United Nations people that were on the flight, but the UN uses the airline, and they were considered a very good airline, very reputable airline.
Todd, would you agree with that record of Ethiopian Airlines? This is an airline that even in the days of Mengistu, the Marxist dictator of Ethiopia, seemed to operate reasonably efficiently and is one of the few airlines that can get you across the whole continent of Africa.
Well, Ethiopian does stand out because of that. They've also had a very, very close relationship with Boeing going back decades. And in fact, Ethiopian was one of the first airlines anywhere in the world to fly the 787. And they have quite a few of those, quite a few 777s, and of course, this newest model of the 737. Now, although Ethiopian has had several fatal events in the past, they also fly in a context that's far more demanding than what you would see in North America or Western Europe. And as the other panelists stated, this is the preferred airline of international business travelers and NGOs who operate in Africa because they span the continent. They have a very large fleet, very regular service around the continent, and they are a trustworthy airline when it comes to how they operate their fleet.
Kyle, one assumes that now in Addis Ababa, there's a great deal of effort going on. Give us your insight to exactly what investigators will be focusing on now and what they'll be looking to from the Lion Air crash.
Well, right now, I think the key is those two recorders, both the data and the cockpit voice recorder is the key. That's what the world is waiting for those to be analyzed. They both were found. The condition of the boxes, has not yet been released. But if there's good data on both, which I assume there will, I think we're going to have a very good picture of what went on in that cockpit and with the airplane in the next several days to possibly a week, depending on the condition of those boxes. So those boxes are, when they're analyzed and when they're complete, it's similar to a home flight simulator. So they could basically plug in to a monitor and they could see the entire flight profile just like you would on, say, a Microsoft Flight Simulator. And in addition to that, there are hundreds and hundreds of flight parameters that are all recorded, such things as positioning of levers, positioning of switches, positioning of flaps. And then the key is going to be the noises in the cockpit. Is there any kind of struggle? Does it sound like, the pilots are trying to push the control yoke or pull on it, or is there any, straining sounds between the pilot and the co-pilot? And one interesting thing to point out, which is very important, is that there actually was communication from the pilots to air traffic control. So typically when you have, say, an airplane just blows up in mid-flight from a bomb or a missile strike, there is no time for the pilots to communicate with the control tower. As pilots, the rule of thumb is aviate, navigate, communicate. And what that means is first you fly the airplane, then you navigate, and then you communicate with the appropriate authorities, whether it be air traffic control or on the emergency frequency.
Okay.
So given the fact that there was communication,
bringing you in, Matt, they'll clearly be wanting to compare what happened with Lion Air. I know we don't yet even have a full result into what happened with that crash. It's still early days. What do we know about that?
Well, if you mean the Lion Air, I mean, one thing I wanted to talk about that your guest just now brought up, there's been some recent reporting that the flight data recorders, I can't remember if it was Associated Press or Reuters or some other agency, but they're reporting that the recorders have sustained some damage, which of course you might, would be normal, but that also there was a bit of a skirmish going on between Ethiopia and the U.S. on where actually the data would be downloaded. Ethiopia had wanted to go to Great Britain, apparently. The U.S. was pushing for the flight recorders to be downloaded in the U.S., and apparently they're going to go to Europe, although they haven't said whether it's going to be Great Britain or some other country. I would assume that it'll probably be Great Britain based on the recordings again. But if your question is about the similarities with Lion Air and Ethiopia, again, we don't know. I mean, there's been eyewitness reports that the plane was trailing smoke and debris, which I will defer to the expertise of your other two guests. but that would seem to contradict what happened with the MCAS system in the Lion Air incident, and might point to something else going on. I don't know if those eyewitness reports are accurate.
OK, we'll come to the MCAS system in a moment, because I think that is important in this discussion. But it's worth explaining how the world has reacted to this. At the moment, there are nearly 350 Boeing 737 MAX planes in service around the world. Let's have a look who's grounded the plane. Ethiopian Airlines is one of at least 16 carriers. The others include Air China, Russia's S7, Fly Dubai and Norwegian Air. And in large parts of the world, the EU, Australia, India and Indonesia, the regulators have banned the jet from their airspace. So where are they still flying the plane? It's the US and Canada. The largest US operator, Southwest Airlines, says it still has confidence in the aircraft. Very different reaction, Todd. You used to work for Boeing. Who's right? Surely it's right to be on the cautious side, isn't it?
There are very good arguments on both sides, either to be out of an abundance of caution to ground the aircraft, or out of a lack of evidence to keep flying until better evidence comes about. And really, in my opinion, if there's any information, either from this accident or from other incidents which may come to light after this accident, if any information comes out which points to a problem, I think it would be prudent for the US and Canada to ground the aircraft. Now, for the time being, that's not the case. But even as we speak, the Canadian authorities are considering limiting which aircraft can fly based on whether the pilots have gotten sufficient supplemental training to deal with the new flight control system. So this is very much a situation that's in flux, and it may change radically in the next few days.
Kyle, this is something that was highlighted even before the latest crash, after the Lion Air crash. It was in the newspapers. The New York Times had a headline back in February: jet software was updated, pilots weren't. Do you see a big problem here? And if there is a big problem with pilots not being brought up to speed, not being given proper training, who's to blame? Boeing or the US authorities?
You know, I think as far as the recurrent training for, complying with any directives that, that went out by the U.S. government, I think it would be the airline's responsibility to ensure that their pilots are up to date on all the newest procedures for, counteracting the system, or, a runaway elevator trim, as they call it. It would be on the airline's responsibility. We have to remember, when the FAA is making decisions about grounding an entire fleet, they're not really concerned with public opinion. They analyze data and they look at the facts. That's what they're doing. And of course, they think like any regular human being does. But, as a body, they're looking at the facts and they're looking at the data. I was actually interviewed about 20 years ago by the NTSB here in the U.S., and they didn't care what my opinion was. They want to know exactly, what I witnessed, what I saw, and frankly, they don't care about opinion or what somebody thinks happened. They just want the facts.
Todd, there's been some reporting in your part of the world, an investigation from the Dallas Morning News showing that US pilots who fly this plane, the 737 MAX, have lodged concerns in an official register. One pilot apparently said it was unconscionable that his company and federal authorities had allowed pilots to fly planes without adequate training. How worried are you when you hear these sort of reports?
Well, the system that you refer to is actually run by NASA, and it exists so that pilots and others in the aviation industry can report things that they think may be a safety issue or may be a security issue. And I did review many of those last night, and I did see that particular comment by that pilot. And that's actually a common concern of pilots in the United States, that the authorities who are responsible, Boeing and the FAA, should have been a bit more forward in informing pilots that this particular version of the 737 has some changes that were not in any of the previous versions. And if a pilot is unaware of those changes, they could put the aircraft into a situation that could be dangerous. Now, I would hope that there are other reports out there that have not yet been put into the system where 737 MAX pilots may have seen something unusual, but thought, well, it wasn't an incident, it wasn't an accident, I didn't have to report it to the authorities. I would hope that now they would take this opportunity to report anything unusual they've seen so that the world aviation community can make a better decision, because frankly, the data from the Ethiopian crash may be days or weeks before that data is analyzed. The world may not have that much time before another aircraft is at risk. So any information that's out there, pilots should get it out into the public eye.
Very worrying thoughts. Matt, how worried should the public be about this particular plane, which is still flying in parts of the world, particularly the US and Canada, and this makes everyone think about getting on a plane? How worried should they be about aviation safety in general, Matt?
Well, I'm smiling. I'm not discounting the seriousness of the situation, but I was flying back from the Philippines yesterday, as a matter of fact, on Silk Air, which has 6 737 MAX 8s in its inventory. And I had tried to get in touch with the airline to find out if that was indeed what we were going to be flying, if that was going to be the equipment on the flight. And I never heard back from them. And when I got to the airport, I was in Cebu. When I got to the airport and was checking in, I asked the lady who was checking me in, are we still flying a 737-8? And right about that time, I got an alert on my phone that China had shut down, had banned, the plane from flying. And she looked at me and she said, no, sir, we've substituted it with an A320. So, I had personal experience with it. I personally was worried, and it's not. I fly frequently as part of the job. I was in the Philippines just a few days ago, or yesterday. I was in Kuala Lumpur before that. I go to Hong Kong pretty soon. I go to South Korea as well. So I'm used to it. But as a human being, yeah, I'm a little bit nervous, and just because of the unknowns that are out there. If we had access to the data from the Ethiopian crash, that would be great. That would go a long way towards sorting a lot of these questions out.
Okay, let me bring in Kyle. Kyle, the problem is you're president there. Kyle, you're president there in the United States. President Trump has been adding his views on this on Twitter, saying we should be worried about the fact that computers now fly planes. Is that a genuine concern, or does that actually make aviation much safer?
Well, it does make aviation much safer. In fairness to him, I think his heart was in the right place. I think he's mainly looking at the worker standpoint, where automation is taking over the world. But as far as it pertains to aviation, these systems are an absolute necessity, and they've saved countless lives in the past. There's no doubt. So if all these systems were taken away, and we don't move forward with more automation, you're going to have loss of life. So these systems need to be in place. There's in the aviation industry.
Todd, very quickly at the end of our discussion, would you reassure people watching this?
Clearly, this is a concern of the entire world, partly because there were 35 nationalities who were killed in this event. And I'm concerned personally because I actually had a family member fly to Ethiopia the next day. I assured her that the information we have, there is nothing to be concerned about over and above the normal risk. But this is a big question. This is something the whole world is taking a look at. This is something that authorities around the world are taking a look at. And I'm absolutely confident that if anything comes about that points to a higher risk anywhere in the system, we'll know about it and we'll take action.
A thought-provoking discussion, particularly if, like me, you're flying in the next 48 hours. Thank you to our guests. We have Kyle Bailey, Todd Curtis and Matt Driscoll. If you want to watch this show again, you'll find it on the website, aljazeera.com. Before I fly away, I'll be back here again on Inside Story. So what should we discuss next time? Let us know, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, bye-bye for now.